The wind came first, not snow, not cold, just wind. It hit the mountains like a blade cutting through the dark before dawn. Trees groaned, loose boards rattled, the kind of sound old-timers recognize right away, the sound that tells you winter isn't knocking anymore, it's already inside the yard. Out here, wind is never just wind. It carries weight, it carries direction, it carries consequences. On mornings like this, most people check their stove, look at the sky, and hope their roof holds. They hope the snow stays light. They hope the forecast is right. Hope is common in mountain towns. Planning is rarer. That's why people laughed when Elias Halvorsen built his roof. They didn't laugh because it was ugly, though it was. They laughed because it was big. Too big. A roof that stretched far past the cabin walls. A roof so steep it looked like it belonged on a church or a barn, not a small mountain cabin. Waste of lumber, they said. Wind will tear it apart, they said. Snow load will crush it, they said. And from a distance they weren't wrong if you judge a roof the way most people do. But Elias wasn't building a roof to hold snow. He was building one to move it. That difference matters. Most modern buildings are designed as static objects. Snow piles up. Engineers calculate the weight. You hope the structure survives until spring. Older designs didn't think that way. Frontier builders didn't ask, how much can this roof carry? They asked, where does the snow go? That's the question this story is really about. Because in the mountains, snow is never neutral. It can block doors, trap people inside collapse sheds, soak firewood, kill livestock, and turn simple chores into dangerous work. Snow decides whether you live comfortably or struggle every single day. Elias understood that, not from books, not from codes, from watching winter's work. And on the morning the wind screamed through the valley like a saw through green timber. His roof was already doing its job, long before anyone else realized they were about to need it. This is not a story about proving neighbors wrong. It's a story about building so winter works for you instead of against you. And it starts with listening to the wind. The town sat high enough that winter arrived early and left late. A few hundred people, one main road, one store, one cafe where the same faces gathered every morning to drink coffee and talk about weather repairs and who was doing what wrong. In places like this, experience counts for everything. Most folks had lived there their whole lives. Some had parents buried on the hillside. Others had worked the mines, the timber crews, or the roads. They knew snow, they knew cold. They knew what worked, and more importantly, what didn't. That's why Elias stood out. He wasn't loud. He didn't give advice unless asked. He didn't argue when people questioned him. He just worked, day after day, morning until dark. But he was still an outsider. And outsiders don't get much benefit of the doubt in mountain towns. When someone builds something unusual, people notice. When someone builds something unusual and large people talk. When someone builds something that seems to go against local common sense, people feel obligated to warn him, sometimes politely, sometimes not. The warnings started friendly. A contractor stopped by first, told Elias the overhang was too deep, said wind would get underneath and rip the roof off, recommended trimming it back to something normal. A retired miner followed. He talked about snow load, did rough math in his head, said no roof needed to be that steep, said it looked dangerous. Later came the jokes, then the bets, then the certainty that this would end badly. None of it surprised Elias. Frontier history is full of this pattern. Someone brings knowledge from somewhere else, not theories, tested habits. The locals judge it through their own experience. Both sides believe they're right, and often both sides are partially right. What the town knew was real wind is brutal here. Snow piles up fast. Materials fail when cold gets inside joints. Many buildings had been damaged over the years by storms that came in sideways and stayed longer than expected. What they didn't see yet was that Elias wasn't copying a design. He was adapting a principle. He wasn't trying to build bigger, he was trying to build smarter. But to the town, all they could see was excess. Too much roof, too much lumber, too much effort for a man living alone in a small cabin. They thought he was overbuilding for a problem that didn't exist. They believed winter was already understood. Winter, as it would soon prove, had its own opinion. Elias Halvorsen didn't talk much about where he came from. When people asked, he gave short answers. Northern country, cold farms, long winters, that was usually enough. But winter had shaped him long before he reached these mountains. He grew up in a place where snow wasn't something you cleared once and forgot. It stayed. It pressed on roofs. It blocked doors. It dictated how animals were fed and how people moved from one building to another. You didn't curse it, you learned it. As a boy, Elias spent winters inside structures built by men who expected snow to behave badly. Barns with steep roofs, deep eaves that kept doors usable, covered walkways that let you move without digging yourself free every morning. The adults didn't explain much. They didn't need to. They pointed. They corrected mistakes. They let weather teach the lesson. If a door froze shut, that was information. If snow drifted where you didn't want it, that was information. If a roof shed snow cleanly, that was success. Those lessons stayed with him. By the time Elias became a carpenter, he understood something many builders never learn. Winter is not random. Snow falls differently depending on wind. Drifts form in predictable places. Cold moves through wood and air in patterns you can plan for. Most people build for how things look on calm days. Elias built for the worst week of the year. That mindset followed him when he moved to this valley. He watched storms instead of television. He walked the property during wind events. He noticed where snow piled up naturally and where ground stayed bare. When he finally started building, he wasn't guessing. He was responding. The roof design wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't pride. It wasn't stubbornness. It was memory. Memory of roofs that never collapsed. Memory of barns that stayed usable when everything else froze. Memory of working under shelter while storms raged outside. To Elias, the roof wasn't a risk. Living without it was. That was the part no one in town could see yet. From the road, the roof made no sense. It reached far beyond the cabin walls, casting a wide shadow, even at midday. The pitch was steep enough that it looked unfinished, like it was waiting for something to be added. The scale felt wrong for such a small living space. People assumed Elias had miscalculated. He hadn't. Every dimension was deliberate. The overhang wasn't there for shade or decoration. It was there to create a working zone space that stayed usable when everything else disappeared under snow. Space where doors wouldn't freeze shut. Space where tools could be handled with gloves off. Space where mistakes wouldn't turn into emergencies. The steep pitch wasn't about style, it was about time. Snow doesn't need to slide instantly. It just needs to leave eventually. The longer it sits, the heavier it gets. Wet snow is dangerous. Compacted snow is worse. Elias wanted snow gone before it had time to become a problem. The roof wasn't built to hold winter. It was built to pass it along. Underneath that roof, Elias planned for storage. Firewood stacked where it would stay dry. Equipment kept out of wind. A workbench that could be used even in bad weather. Later, he added a small south-facing growing space, protected enough to keep greens alive longer than anyone thought possible. None of this required machines. No heaters, no fans, no moving parts. Just geometry. The roof directed snow where Elias wanted it. It shaped drifts instead of fighting them. As snow slid off, it piled along the perimeter, slowly building a wall that blocked wind and trapped still air near the cabin. Still air is warmth. This wasn't theory. Elias had watched it happen elsewhere. He knew how long it took for snow walls to form. He knew how high they would grow. He knew how they changed the way cold moved across the ground. To the town, it looked like overkill. To Elias, it was margin. Margin is what keeps small problems from becoming life-threatening ones. Margin is what lets you work calmly while others rush. Margin is what frontier builders always sought, because winter doesn't forgive tight tolerances. The roof looked wrong because it was solving a problem most people didn't realize they had. Yet, once the roof frame stood up, the tone changed. This wasn't just unusual anymore. It was public, impossible to ignore. The size alone invited opinions, and in a town like this, opinions travel fast. Most of the criticism came from a place of confidence. People weren't guessing. They were applying what they knew. One man talked about wind getting under the overhang and lifting the roof like a sail. Another spoke about snow load estimating weight in thousands of pounds. Someone else mentioned ice build-up freeze-thaw cycles and structural fatigue. They weren't wrong concepts. They were just incomplete. Their calculations treated the roof like a flat surface with snow sitting on it for months. A static problem: add weight, subtract strength, wait for failure. That's how modern buildings are often analyzed. But Elias wasn't building a static object. He was building a system that changed as weather changed. When people warned him, he listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend himself. He thanked them for their concern. Then he kept working. That quiet response frustrated some people more than an argument would have. It felt dismissive even when it wasn't. They mistook calm for arrogance. A few younger men started joking openly. They called it the hangar. They placed bets on which storm would bring it down. Someone said it was only a matter of time before it collapsed and took the cabin with it. Elias heard it all. Frontier history is full of similar moments. New methods often look foolish until the environment tests them. And the environment doesn't care how convincing your math sounds at a coffee counter. Math matters, engineering matters, but only when the right variables are included. What the town's math didn't account for was movement. Snow that slides, wind that gets redirected, weight that transfers to the ground instead of staying overhead. They were calculating for a roof that held snow. Elias had built one that refused to. That difference would soon become impossible to ignore. Because winter was already lining up its evidence, gathering wind and snow in the high country, waiting for a structure worth testing. Long before engineers ran numbers, people learned winter through failure. Cabins collapsed. Roofs sagged. Doors froze shut. Livestock died because someone couldn't reach the feed in time. Those lessons weren't written down. They were remembered or they were repeated. Frontier builders didn't have the luxury of guessing twice. They learned that a shallow roof was easy to build but hard to live with. Snow stayed, ice formed, weight increased day after day. Eventually something gave way. They learned that small overhangs looked neat but trapped people inside. A single storm could block every door. You could have heat and food inside but still be stuck. They learned that wind was as dangerous as cold. Wind stripped heat from buildings. It pushed snow into cracks and seams. It turned minor leaks into major failures. So they adjusted. Barns grew steeper roofs. Cabins gained deep eaves. Walkways appeared between buildings. Firewood sheds were pulled under cover. Nothing fancy, just changes that made winter less destructive. These designs weren't copied from books. They were copied from what survived. In snow-heavy regions, Scandinavia, the Alps, parts of northern Japan, builders figured out something critical: snow isn't always the enemy. In the right place, packed snow blocks wind and insulates better than bare air ever could. But only if you control where it goes. That control came from shape, angle, distance. A steep roof sheds snow before it compacts. A wide overhang keeps walls dry and usable. Let snow pile where it helps you, not where it traps you. Modern construction moved away from this thinking. cheaper materials, faster builds, designs that assume constant maintenance and outside energy. Frontier builders didn't assume help was coming. They assumed storms would last longer than expected, that tools would break, that fuel would run low, that mistakes would cost time they didn't have. So they built margin into their structures. Elias didn't invent his roof. He inherited the logic behind it. The understanding that winter is predictable if you pay attention long enough. What looked outdated to the town was actually older than the town itself. And older ideas tend to survive harsh environments better than new ones because they already have. Most roofs are designed to carry snow. That single assumption shapes everything: beam size, spacing, cost, and risk. Snow lands, snow stays, weight builds. The structure waits it out. Elias rejected that idea completely. He didn't ask how much snow the roof could hold. He asked how fast it could get rid of it. That's a different problem. Snow behaves like a solid only after it sits. Fresh snow is light. Cold snow slides easily. The danger comes when it stays long enough to compress, melt slightly, then refreeze. That's when weight multiplies. So Elias designed for speed. The steep pitch wasn't arbitrary. It was calculated so snow couldn't settle comfortably. The metal surface mattered too, not for looks, but for friction. Smooth enough that snow released quickly even in cold conditions. Snow landed, snow moved, snow left. But it didn't disappear. It went exactly where Elias wanted it to go. As snow slid off the roof, it piled around the perimeter. Day by day, the drifts grew higher, shaped by wind and gravity into dense, sloped walls. Not random heaps, structured barriers. Those walls did three things at once. First, they blocked wind. Wind doesn't hit a vertical wall and stop. It gets pushed upward and over. The snow walls turned screaming ground-level wind into something that passed above the cabin. Second, they trapped still air. Still air is insulation. Even a few degrees matter when you're heating with wood and carrying water by hand. Third, they created a working zone. Under the overhang, Elias could walk workstack wood and open doors without digging. The roof only carried snow briefly, minutes, hours at most. The ground carried the rest. That shift from roof to ground changed everything. Static calculations stopped applying. The structure wasn't waiting under load. It was constantly unloading itself. This is what modern analysis often misses. Buildings don't have to resist nature head-on. They can redirect it. Elias wasn't fighting snow. He was choreographing it. Once you understand that the roof stops looking excessive, it starts looking precise. And when the storm finally arrived, the kind that tests ideas instead of opinions, the roof was already doing exactly what it was built to do. Elias didn't trust shortcuts, not because he was stubborn, but because winter exposes weak connections faster than anything else. Cold shrinks wood. Wind works joints loose. Snow finds gaps you didn't know existed. So he built the frame the old way. The main posts were oversized on purpose, not because he didn't understand load limits, but because thick timber moves slower. It checks less. It absorbs stress instead of transferring it sharply. That matters when temperatures swing 30 degrees in a day. Each post went deep below the frost line where the ground doesn't heave and twist with freeze and thaw. That alone prevents decades of slow damage. The joints were not metal brackets and screws. They were wood joined to wood. Mortise and tenon, pegged tight. No play, no flex where it shouldn't flex. In cold weather, metal contracts differently than wood. It loosens, it squeaks, it fails quietly. Wood on wood moves together. That's why frontier barns still stand when newer sheds fall apart. Elias shaped each joint by hand, not for romance, for fit. When a joint fits perfectly, the load spreads across surfaces instead of concentrating on fasteners. That's how structures survive wind that hits sideways and snow that arrives in waves. The roof ribs were spaced closer than modern codes require, not to hold snow, but to resist uplift. Wind tries to peel roofs apart before it ever pushes them down. Tight spacing keeps the skin attached when gusts come in under pressure. None of this was experimental. It was conservative. Frontier builders couldn't call for replacement parts in January. They overbuilt because repairs in winter were dangerous. They built once and lived with it. Elias followed the same rule. By the time the last roof panel went on, the structure felt solid in a way that's hard to describe but easy to recognize. No vibration, no rattle, just mass and balance. It didn't look modern. It looked ready. And readiness is the difference between a shelter and a liability when the weather stops being polite. Elias didn't wait for forecasts to tell him when to prepare. He prepared because winter always collects debt and demands payment when you're tired, cold, or distracted. Under the wide roof, he built systems that worked even when everything else failed. Firewood came first, not just stacked but sorted. Split sizes for different needs, smaller pieces for quick heat, larger ones for overnight burns, all of it stored off the ground under cover with airflow that kept it dry even during heavy snow. Dry wood is safety. Wet wood is stress. Next came light. Elias didn't depend on one source. Lanterns, oil lamps, candles placed where they couldn't tip. Winter storms knock out power quietly, and darkness makes simple tasks dangerous. Then water. Containers kept inside the sheltered zone so they wouldn't freeze solid. Snow melting takes time and fuel. Elias treated liquid water like a resource, not a guarantee. Food followed the same logic, simple, dense, and predictable. Beans, oats, salt, dried meat. Nothing fancy, nothing fragile. The roof made all of this easier. While other people hauled wood through blowing snow, Elias stayed under cover. While others chipped ice off doors, his doors opened freely. While others rushed to prepare at the last minute, he adjusted calmly. He also planned for movement. A rope line ran from the cabin door to the work area. In whiteout conditions, you don't rely on memory, you rely on touch. That rope meant he could move safely even when visibility dropped to nothing. These weren't dramatic preparations. No heroics. Just habits formed by people who understood how fast conditions can turn bad. Elias didn't assume help would come. He assumed he would be on his own for days. That assumption changes how you build and how you store. By the time the temperature dropped and the wind shifted, Elias wasn't scrambling. He was finished. The cabin wasn't just ready to survive a storm. It was ready to function during one. And that distinction matters more than most people realize right up until the moment they need it. The storm wasn't supposed to be serious. 8 inches, maybe 12. Some wind. Cold, but nothing unusual. The kind of weather people in the mountains shrug off while topping off coffee cups and checking their stoves. That assumption lasted about half a day. Snow started falling in the early afternoon. Light at first, then steady. By nightfall, the wind picked up and began pushing snow sideways. Not swirling, driving, the kind that fills tracks as fast as you make them. By morning, the storm hadn't moved. It sat over the valley like it had nowhere else to go. Snow kept coming. The wind didn't let up. Gusts hit hard enough to make buildings groan. Power lines went down quietly, one section at a time, until the town went dark. Roads vanished. Not closed, vanished. You couldn't tell where they had been even a day earlier. Drifts formed in places that never drifted before. Familiar landmarks disappeared. This is how storms turn dangerous, not because they arrive violently, but because they stay. By the second night, people stopped calling it weather and started calling it trouble. Doors froze shut. Sheds collapsed under weight they were never meant to carry. Firewood buried in open racks became unreachable. Snow packed tight against walls, stealing heat faster than stoves could replace it. That's when concern shifted. Not about the storm itself, but about Elias. Someone mentioned his roof. said if it was going to fail, this would be the storm. Another said no one had seen him all day. No lights, no tracks. In a valley, this small silence stands out. A few people argued it was too dangerous to check. Wind was pushing hard, visibility was almost gone, but doing nothing felt worse. If that roof had come down, Elias might not be able to get out. And if he was injured, time mattered. So two men pulled on their coats, tied scarves tight, and stepped into the white. They expected to find broken timbers. What they found instead forced them to rethink everything they thought they understood about snow roofs and winter itself. The wind tried to push them back the moment they left the road. Snow didn't fall so much as move sideways, stinging exposed skin and filling every gap in clothing. Visibility dropped to a few yards at best. They stayed close to the ditch line, feeling their way forward with boots and memory. Neither man spoke much, talking wasted breath. Both were thinking the same thing. If the roof failed, it would have failed already. They expected debris, twisted metal, broken beams half buried in drifts, maybe worse. As they came over the rise toward Elias's place, the shape of the roof appeared through the white, not sagging, not torn, standing clean and sharp against the storm. It looked wrong because it was intact. They moved closer, fighting the wind step by step. Snow lay deep everywhere else, piled high against fences and equipment. But around the cabin, something strange was happening. The ground beneath the overhang was mostly clear, not bare everywhere, but walkable. Snow had drifted in on one side, but the rest formed a solid wall around the perimeter, tall, dense, sculpted by the wind itself. They stepped under the roof and felt the change immediately. The wind vanished, not weakened, gone. They could hear it screaming overhead, but it no longer touched them. The air was still, calm, almost quiet. The temperature felt warmer, not comfortable, but noticeably different from the chaos outside. Then they saw Elias. He stood at a workbench under the roof lantern light, steady planing a piece of wood as if it were an ordinary evening. A small stove burned nearby, firewood stacked neatly along the wall, dry as summer. He looked up surprised but unalarmed. "You made it through," he said simply. They stared for a moment before one of them finally spoke. "How is this standing?" Elias set the plane down and poured coffee from a pot kept warm near the stove. "The roof," he said, handing them mugs, "is not fighting the storm." Outside, the blizzard raged. Under the roof, winter had been reduced to a problem already solved. They stood there longer than they meant to, not because they were cold, but because they weren't. Under the roof, the difference was impossible to ignore. The air didn't bite. The wind didn't shove. Snow didn't swirl into their eyes. It was calm in a way that felt almost unnatural after the walk in. Elias didn't rush to explain. He let them feel it first. "This is what the roof does," he said finally. "It changes how winter behaves." One of the men stepped back toward the edge of the overhang and pointed. The snow walls stood chest high in places packed hard by wind. Not loose drifts, dense-shaped barriers that curved naturally around the structure. Elias nodded. "Snow wants to settle. Wind wants to move. You give them a shape, they follow it." He explained it simply. The roof only carried snow for a short time. It slid off before it could compact. That meant the load on the structure never grew large. Instead, gravity moved the weight to the ground where it stopped being dangerous. "People calculate snow like it stays put," Elias said, "but it doesn't, not on this roof." The walls mattered just as much. As the snow piled up around the perimeter, it blocked ground-level wind. Wind that normally strips heat from walls now flowed upward and over the roofline. What stayed underneath was still air, and still air holds warmth. No fans, no insulation tricks, just shape. One of the men shook his head slowly. "So the storm builds the protection." "Yes," Elias said, "that is the point." He showed them the firewood. Dry, accessible, enough to last weeks. He showed them the doors opening freely while others in town were frozen shut. He showed them the workspace where tools stayed usable instead of buried. They realized something then. This wasn't luck, and it wasn't overbuilding. It was preparation for the exact conditions everyone else was now struggling through. Outside, the storm continued to punish the valley. Inside the shelter of that roof, winter had already been accounted for and dismissed. The storm broke 3 days later, not gently. It tore itself away from the valley, leaving silence and damage behind. Nearly 4 feet of snow lay across the town. Some roofs sagged, a few sheds collapsed. Doors were frozen shut in more than one home. Power stayed out for days. When people could finally move again, they took stock. That's when the conversations changed. At Elias's place, nothing had shifted. The roof stood exactly as it had before. The snow walls still ringed the cabin, high and solid, slowly hardening in the cold. The ground under the overhang remained clear enough to walk. People started stopping by, not to warn him anymore, but to ask questions. One of the town's engineers came next, tape measure in hand, notebook out. He walked the perimeter, checked angles, examined joints, and stood quietly for a long time under the roof. "I evaluated this wrong," he admitted. He explained what he'd missed. His earlier thinking treated the roof as a static structure. Snow sitting weight accumulating failure as a matter of time. What Elias had built didn't allow that condition to exist. The maximum load was brief. The system shed snow continuously. The real mass ended up on the ground where it formed a protective barrier instead of a hazard. That changed the math completely. When the engineer recalculated using time-based loading instead of static accumulation, the numbers dropped sharply. What looked dangerous on paper became conservative. In reality, others listened. Builders, ranchers, people responsible for equipment and animals. They saw how Elias stayed warm, how his firewood lasted longer, how he never had to dig himself out just to function. The roof wasn't just surviving storms. It was reducing daily labor. And that's a form of efficiency no spreadsheet captures easily. By the end of the week, people stopped calling it excessive. They started calling it smart. Winter hadn't changed. Their understanding of it had. Winter has a way of stripping opinions down to what works. After the storm, no one argued anymore. They observed. They compared. They counted how many times they had to shovel, how much wood they burned, how long it took to get back to normal. Elias never said, "I told you so." He didn't need to. People could see it, while others spent days clearing doors and digging paths just to reach their sheds. Elias walked freely under his roof. While some struggled with damp firewood and frozen hinges, his systems kept working the way they were designed to work. A few of the loudest critics were the first to admit they'd misjudged it. Not dramatically, not publicly, just quietly, one-on-one. "I didn't think about snow moving," one man said. "I didn't think about wind being redirected," another admitted. "I never thought a roof could change the ground," someone else added. Those statements mattered. They marked the point where experience expanded instead of doubling down. Frontier history is full of this moment. The point where knowledge isn't defended anymore, it's updated. Where people accept that survival isn't about pride, it's about results. Elias welcomed questions. He showed measurements. He explained angles. He talked about why he made certain parts bigger than necessary and others smaller. He explained trade-offs, not rules. "Every place is different," he said. "Snow weight, wind direction, temperature swings. You don't copy, you adjust." That approach earned trust. Soon people weren't asking if the roof was safe. They were asking how to apply the idea to their own buildings. Equipment sheds, animal shelters, wood storage. Even small changes, deeper eaves, steeper pitches started showing up around town. Not replicas, adaptations. That's how useful knowledge spreads. Not as a blueprint, but as a way of thinking. The storm hadn't just tested a structure, it had tested assumptions. And the ones that survived were the ones flexible enough to change. Years later, people still talked about that winter. Not because it was the worst on record, but because it changed how they thought. It showed in plain terms that survival isn't about fighting nature harder. It's about understanding it better. Elias never became famous. He didn't patent anything. He didn't start a business selling storm-proof designs. He kept living the same way he always had, quietly, deliberately paying attention. But the roof left a mark, not just on the landscape, but on the habits of the town. New sheds were built with deeper overhangs. Roof pitches increased. Firewood moved under cover. Doors were placed where drifting snow wouldn't trap them. People started watching storms instead of just reacting to them. The lesson was simple, but it ran deep. Build for the week that breaks things. Design for the moment when help doesn't come. Assume you'll have to keep working while the storm is still happening. That's frontier thinking. The roof wasn't big because Elias was careless with lumber. It was big because he was careful with effort. Every shovel of snow you don't have to move is energy saved. Every door that opens without force is risk reduced. Every dry piece of firewood is warmth you can count on. Modern life hides those truths. We heat, we power, we repair without thinking much about where the limits are. But winter still finds them. Elias understood something older than codes, and newer than tradition systems matter more than parts. A roof isn't just a roof. It's how snow moves, how wind behaves, how people live day to day when conditions turn hostile. What looked strange at first turned out to be practical wisdom made visible. And that's the heart of the frontier spirit. Not toughness for its own sake, not stubbornness, but calm preparation built quietly long before it's needed. When the next storm came, and it always did, the roof didn't need to prove itself again. It simply did what it was built to do, and that in the end is the highest standard any shelter can meet.